Hi, my name is Grant Koniski, and this is my 2020 Master of Architecture thesis for the University of Cincinnati, under the guidance of advisors Michael McInturf and Liz Roden. The goal of the discrete architectural interventions of this thesis is to provide a methodology for the analysis of parks and the designing of low-cost, human-scaled interventions that aim to subtly address the problems produced by the infamous San Francisco housing crisis by increasing the utility of the existing parks of the city during the winter months. The final interventions focus mainly on Fort Mason Park. Fort Mason Park boasts emblematic views of the Golden Gate Bridge and the San Francisco Bay. The five human-scaled interventions were developed by iterating and developing human-scaled forms that respond to five key fundamental spatial characteristics that organize all parks. The five characteristics or spatial topologies are defined as frame, enclosure, path, field, slope. These interventions promote passive recreation within San Francisco parks with the aim to create public living spaces for the population that lacks personal living spaces. I researched tactical urbanism and the ways this movement intervenes publicly and discreetly within an urban environment. Tactical urbanism is often low-cost interventions that are enacted incognito by the citizens as a way of enriching their public spaces. Sol LeWitt is a great example of a designer that develops a methodology of design rules and iteration to drive a set of geometric forms. The postmodern sculpture of the 60s and 70s created a purity of form and space. The human-based scales of the designs brought sculpture into the world of architecture. Tony Smith was a key example of one of the postmodern sculptors that really broke down the boundaries between architecture and sculpture. He created sculptures that were meant to be inhabited and put in public spaces. Robert Morris developed a form class, which is a series of iterations of similar geometric traits. Robert Morris defined complex spaces with simple forms. Bernard Tschumi popularized the idea of unprogrammed architectural spaces. His Follies and his 1984 Parc des Villettes created a series of autonomous design rules within a datum grid system which provided design constraints that allowed him to apply these concepts to the brownfield he was provided. Contemporary architects often develop meaning through an analysis of the site. Frank Habermas uses a strictly hand modeling process and increases in scale until he finally reaches his full-scale intervention. In Luminous Drapes, Studio Toggle applies anthropometric analysis to drive their design method and their spatial organization. Studio Toggle then used lighting and modularity to express each of the different modes of activity they identified in the drawings earlier. San Francisco's housing crisis has created a variety of architectural conditions, such as an abundance of luxury housing and a lack of affordable housing. The continuing migration of tech workers have pushed out people that once made the city so diverse. Renting a room is standard for professionals living in the city, and many do not offer living rooms or communal spaces for gathering. This results in much of the population being limited to just their personal box, their room. The displacement of San Francisco's diversity has created a distaste towards tech companies and their growing influence on art, architecture, and culture. This thesis introduces a set of analog influence design processes within San Francisco parks. Meet Sam. He lives bayside along a 1997 Catalina 30 sailing boat. He pays $250 for a liveaboard fee and $250 for a slip fee, a total of $500 a month. Sam frequents and relies on his nearby park, the James Herman Cruise Terminal. He uses the space to take his dog out, to meet with friends, and to skateboard. Meet Eric. Eric's garage is not zoned for residential use. He lives with his family rent-free. Eric lives around the corner from Fort Mason Park and has defined that park as his living room. He uses it for large meetups, dates, skateboarding, relaxing, reading, and practicing his guitar. Michelle lives in a lofted bedroom inside of a warehouse, non-compliant with fire codes. She pays $600 in cash a month for rent. She frequents Dolores Park as her nearby waiting spot, meeting spot, hanging spot, a spot to play her guitar, read her book, meditate, and a spot to just live. The city has sacrificed living spaces for density, which in turn reinforces the need for the communal spaces that the San Francisco parks provide. San Francisco's 220 parks are commonly populated year-round, full of people exercising, playing games, gathering, drinking, reading, playing music, and so on. These lively green spaces are one of the trademarks of the outgoing city. This need for a space to gather does not get filled in the winter months when the wind and rain pick up and the sun sets early, making the once friendly park seem dark and uninviting. As I pulled together a catalog of parks to intervene within, I created a set of rules. I was looking for parks that lacked architectural and artistic identities, parks that range in social, spatial, and architectural qualities, parks that are situated within a dense urban context, and parks that provide the local community with living spaces. Once I compiled a list of parks that I thought were iconic of San Francisco, I settled upon the three parks. The three parks were Fort Mason Park in the Marina, the James Herman Cruise Terminal in North Beach, and the Mission Dolores Park in the Mission. I documented the three parks I had chosen and started to understand the activity that goes on within the park. Dolores Park is an incredibly popular park in San Francisco. The park has a steep hillside topography that slopes in the direction of the skyline. The diversity of spatial cues and their organization impacts the various modes of social engagement in Dolores Park. The James Herman Cruise Terminal at Pier 27 in North Beach, San Francisco, is a park that is frequently populated by tourists and skateboarders. The plaza is along the Embarcadero, prompting a steady flow of pedestrian traffic. The plaza is transformed every Tuesday as a cruise ship arrives, flooding the city with new tourists. The interventions of this thesis are developed in full for Fort Mason Park in the Marina District. The meandering paths and grassy lawns offer stunning views of the emblematic Golden Gate Bridge. The park is frequented by cyclists, walkers, and runners. The park is a meeting place for dog groups, yoga groups, frisbee groups, and many other informal and formal groups. The park offers a great view of the bay and provides an ideal viewing experience for the Blue Angel Air Show every fall. This park fills up every day with tourists who rent bikes in the famous Fisherman's Wharf and follow the Bayside Embarcadero Trail, which passes directly through Fort Mason Park. The park is poorly lit at night, making the paths dangerous for cyclists and pedestrians. I began with looking at the San Francisco housing crisis. The city's loss of living spaces creates a reliance on the public parks for living spaces. Public parks in San Francisco are unable to provide the living spaces that are needed during the winter due to lack of infrastructure and lighting. In response to those problems, discrete architectural interventions can provide the needed utility in the winter. To mindfully intervene within an existing park, I looked at the parks through an architectural lens. I broke the parks down into 5 fundamental topologies that organize the park spaces. Frame, the intentional framing of an emblematic or significant view. Enclosure, a sense of enclosure. Groupings of trees, density of planters, man-made canopies, pavilions, and adjacent buildings. Path, the circular character of the park, defined by benches, signs, slopes, foliage, and adjacent trees. Field, the stage for activity within the park, a level and open grass field. Slope, provides boundaries and an elevated perspective of the space. I looked at these 3 parks through the lens of these 5 spatial topologies. I looked at how the central palm trees frame the skyline of the city, and how the foliage around the park's borders is used to frame the surroundings and the vistas that the park provides. I looked at how a dense cluster of short palm trees can create an enclosure within the park and allow for more private gatherings. I looked at how the park utilized benches and palm trees as a way of defining paths. The James Herman Cruise Terminal uses more hardscaping techniques than the other 2 parks. This plaza uses steel H-columns and I-beams to create a consistent design language within the site. The plaza uses a large glowing sign as a means to draw people from the Embarcadero path into the plaza. And the final park, Fort Mason. Fort Mason is used as the main focus for the interventions because I found that this park is a clear example of all of these 5 topologies I have defined. The large palm trees that run through the center of the park frame the iconic Golden Gate Bridge. These central palm trees also provide a sense of enclosure for the inhabitants of the park. The paths are highly frequented by tourists, bikers, and other modes of transportation. The painted lanes, signs, and maps are placed as a means to manage the high volume of traffic. The large field that comprises the majority of the park creates a social stage for activity. The steeply sloped grass banks towards the edges of the park define its boundaries. The initial designs of this thesis relied on a strictly analog design process. The process involved sketching, hand drafting while model making, and finally a digital visualization into the site. The first study was titled Waypoint. The study used simple geometric objects and aggregated them as a way of creating wayfinding points. The next study was approaching the open field of the park. This study looked at the flat open topography that makes up the majority of the park. This intervention looked at situating itself adjacent to the central strip of palm trees. The large scale creates an inviting enclosure for nighttime gatherings. Box cloud was intended to separate the clique gatherings of the park. The object is aggregated into 3 similar distinct objects that allow people to gather and create a space for their own group or themselves. The 5th study, Slice, orients itself towards the skyline view and creates a small gathering space and a larger open gathering space. The 6th intervention, Face, was meant to activate the elevated field and orient passersby from the Embarcadero to the plaza. Building a simple stud-framed wall with translucent trace paper and cheap programmable LED strips, I was able to create an effective means of lighting that is programmable and affordable. I then used 2x2 studs and oriented strand board to frame out the module that I was thinking about using for my final interventions. The oriented strand board is covered in acrylic roofing membrane and then painted in an exterior paint. The interventions would be raised on blocks as a means to promote water drainage. I used an 18-inch module to approach the designing of human-scaled interventions. The modules have 4 main units. The first one is a simple 2x2 set of stud framing. The second one is the light with a 45-degree angled end. The third unit is a heavier module with 2x4 beams running across the top of the unit and 45-degree supporting braces. And the fourth unit is the reinforced unit with a 45-degree angled end to it. The materials are brought to the warehouse, the modules are fabricated, they are then brought to the site and placed according to the group's designs, clad with the materials, and painted in their intended color codes. The interventions are intended to be designed and fabricated in November, built in December, inhabited January to March, disassembled for summertime, and brought back to storage until the next winter. The final interventions of this thesis utilize the 5 topologies and a sequential iterative design process. The parks are analyzed, the topologies are iterated, and an intervention is picked and cited. The frame permeations are forms that direct, orient, and frame the main view of the park. The final selections activity is visualized, and a final selection is made for the frame topology. The enclosure permeations are forms that enclose, shelter, and shade. The enclosure forms are a good example of how the color coding works. The pastel colors define the larger planes, and the vibrant colors define the structural objects of the architecture. The path permeations are forms that direct, orient, and frame circulation along the essential path. These interventions intend to create a visual cue for circulation and increase visibility and safety. At night, these interventions create a space for cyclists to briefly pull off and resituate for the long night ride ahead. The field permeations are forms that encourage the existing activity and attention that is implied within the central level field of a park. The final choice was one that created different levels of elevation as a means of creating different modes of engagement. The slope permeations are rectilinear forms that are situated along a park's sloped grass spaces. The final selection is one that creates a platform as well as an internal space for seating. The inside planes light up at night and create a warm space where you can look out over the park and the city. This thesis began its investigations with the many architectural problems that plague San Francisco. Architectural problems that stem from the ongoing housing crisis. A lack of communal living spaces has pushed the population to rely on their local neighborhood parks for living and gathering spaces. This dependence and loyalty San Franciscans have to their local neighborhood parks becomes a valuable phenomenon, significant to the identity of San Francisco. It is this phenomenon that this thesis studies and develops into a set of abstract architectural interventions as a way to discreetly ease the problems that plague the city.